In this Warframe guide, I'm gonna tell you everything you need to know to do the maximum damage possible and go from this all the way up to this. We're gonna start easy with tricks that really everyone can do and then ramp up the complexity step by step, so no matter if you're a total Warframe beginner or a veteran with already 1,000 hours on the clock, this guide is for you. Big shout out to all our generous channel members who help me keep the lights on, and now let's jump right into it. Starting out with the very basics, and that is just Git Good, scrub. Nah, I'm just kidding. But what I'm trying to say here is that, of course, if you try to aim properly and if you nail those headshots or in general hit the weak spots of an enemy, then naturally you're gonna deal way more damage than if you're just going for body shots. So yeah, even though that's pretty obvious, I would say try to aim as good as you can to reap the nice rewards. And by the way, should you be playing on mobile or maybe Nintendo Switch, which happen to be two platforms where aiming tends to be a bit mechanically difficult, then my personal tip would be don't go for high damage, low fire rate weapons like sniper rifles or bows, because if you miss one of those shots, it's gonna really sting. Better go for assault rifles, higher fire rate weapons in general, or AoE weapons, explosive stuff where you don't even need to hit the enemy directly, but just the floor in front of them, and that will blow them up anyway. If you want to have some more weapon suggestions that are going that direction, then you can always check out this guide right here where I talk about the best weapons on mobile and in general when aiming tends to be a bit more difficult. But alright, I get it. Tips like, oh, just hit the enemy are not gonna be really helpful, and that's not why you click this video, so let's talk about something that might be of more interest to you, and that would be just picking the right weapons. See, Warframe has, by now I think, hundreds of different weapons, so it can be quite confusing as to which of these are actually good, and especially if you feel that you're struggling with damage, then maybe upgrading a weapon would already solve that problem to a certain extent. But the question would be, which weapon is a good weapon? Now, I don't want to get too much into the detail right here because I have made countless of videos on these types of topics already. The best beginner weapons, the best mid-game weapons, the best end-game weapons. So I would say if you want to have the full picture and all the ideas and inspirations that you can get, then these would be the places to go. However, just as a rule of thumb, the first early game weapon that you will probably encounter that is really good would be the Heck at Mastery Rank 4. If you like that shotgun, it is worth investing a bit into that. Followed up by Mastery Rank 6 with the Soma, absolutely great rifle and can carry you through the entire star chart and story. The Atomos Mastery Rank 5 is a great support weapon in the secondary slot, and in general, everything below Mastery Rank 4, please do not invest your hard-earned Formant Orc Catalyst into that, because these are rare resources and MR 1 to 3 weapons are usually pretty trash and not worth the investment. As for which other weapons are great into the later mid-game, after you get the Soma, I would like to refer you to my mid-game weapons video or the end-game weapons videos that I put out for every single weapon class. There, you will find a lot of inspiration and great guns to play around with. But Blacky, I hear you say, weapons and guns and melees are not the only thing in the game that can deal damage. What about Warframes? What if I don't want to use my weapon? What if I want to deal my damage with the Warframe and their abilities? Well, in this case, obviously you want to make sure to pick the right Warframe for the job that deals a lot of damage, and when it comes to that, unfortunately I don't have a dedicated guide on which are the best DPS Warframes in the game just yet. However, some quick personal suggestions from my side would be Mesa, Seren, Dante, Gauss, and Octavia. By the way, I will make a more detailed video on the best DPS frames in the game, and that will be coming up in the next couple of weeks at some point, so if you don't want to miss out on that, you might want to consider maybe leaving the channel a sub and join the crew. But now, let's take a look at what the next step will be after you've chosen your Warframe and your weapons of choice. So, how do you make your weapon or Warframe of choice as strong as humanly possible? As I said in the intro, we're gonna start small with the steps that every even beginner can take to upgrade their damage, and then step by step get more professional and more endgame as we go. When it comes to making weapons and Warframe strong, then the first milestone that every Warframe player should aim to achieve is, first and foremost, complete a full build. Craft a weapon, invest an Orc Catalyst and a couple of Forma into it, so that you're able to even fit 8 mods into all the mod slots, and of course, you need to get the required mods at the same time. This is nothing that you can do right after the game starts because you're gonna be lacking some of the more crucial mods and it will take some time to acquire everything that you need. So if you feel that you're not there just yet, that's no problem. Just continue going through the game and try to expand your arsenal of mods and upgrades. Now, you might be asking yourself, that's all nice and well, but what are the mods that I need for my weapon and for my Warframe? Which are the ones that I'm looking for? And I've already put out a dedicated step-by-step weapon building guide last year that is like 20 or something minutes long. As for building Warframes, I have a sister video for that step-by-step explains how to build a new Warframe in the game, but since you're already here now, let me just briefly give you some ideas. If you want to build a Warframe for damage dealing, then usually what you're looking into is having high ability strength. You know, damage dealing abilities on Warframes generally scale with ability strength, meaning the more ability strength you have, the more damage the Warframe will deal. This, of course, leaves a lot of nuance on the side and is very generalized, so if you have a dedicated Warframe that you want to make a good build for, then I would recommend maybe looking up a dedicated build guide for said Warframe on YouTube and get some specialized tips from there. As for weapons, what you're usually looking into is making a mod loadout that gives a bit of everything, but not too much of one and the same thing to avoid diminishing returns. What I mean is have one base damage mod, have one multi-shot mod, one mod for crit chance, one mod for status chance, either one or two mods for a single or a combined element, a faction damage mod, and then maybe fire rate or something. This will be a very generalized, very standardized build for pretty much any weapon out there that has some solid base stats that will get quite some nice performance out of the gun. Now, one thing that you do need to keep in mind here is, and that is very important because I read some comments now and then that seem to not know this, you can level up your mods in your mod collection in the Orbiter. Absolutely go and do that. At base, when you just get the mod, when it's level 0, the stats on pretty much any mod out there are completely useless. You need to take credits and endo and level up your mod to get the higher stats out of this, and then will you start seeing the damage numbers. Just one tip on the side, there are mods that can go up to level 10 and they're usually very expensive to max out completely, so when you're still a newer player, only get those mods to level 7 or 8 because until then the costs are very manageable, and beyond level 8 there's not that much more upgrade in the damage numbers, so early on it's really not worth it to max out those big mods. Now, the next step when weapon modding would be picking the right element for the enemy faction that you're up against. As it stands right now, in the Warframe wiki there is a very big complex table that shows which enemy health types are strong and weak against which types of elemental damage, but that's soon going to be obsolete because in roughly 2 weeks we're going to get a new update that completely revamps which enemies are strong and weak against which element. So right here, right now, I'm not going to give you a whole rundown and just say that after this update launches, when you're on the star chart in your mission select screen, then in the small info card about the mission that you're about to start, it will show which elements the enemies that you're going up against are strong and weak against so that you can adjust your loadout accordingly. Also, one thing when we're talking about weapon modding that I want to mention is faction mods are actually really good. I know a lot of you don't like faction mods because you need to swap them out whenever you go up against a different enemy faction. And, you know, if you just don't want to use them, then that's completely fine. It's none of my business. You can make competent builds even without them. But as a guide YouTuber, I would do a bad job if I wouldn't recommend them because even though the numbers on those faction damage mods are relatively low, the way that they work in the overall damage formula makes it that the damage increase that you get from them is actually way more significant than it might look on paper. And now, with all that in mind, after you've made a full build with all types of different mods, you know, damage, multi-shot, crit chance, crit damage element, and all that good stuff, that will probably give you enough power to finish the entire star chart and the main story of the game. However, once you transition into higher level, endgame, steel path potentially, you will notice that these type of builds drop off very sharply. So, how can you make it better? Well, the first step when you want to get out of mid-game hell would be going for galvanized mods. Galvanized mods are specific versions of those base mods that feature drastically better stats. In order to get them, you will have to first finish the entire star chart, which unlocks the game mode arbitrations, and from the resource called Vitus Essence that you get from playing arbitrations, you can go to a relay to the room of the Arbiters of Hexes, talk to this guy right here, and he sells the galvanized mods for Vitus Essence. Now, there are quite some galvanized mods, but my personal recommendation would be prioritizing the galvanized multi-shot mods as well as the galvanized status chance mods. And then another great tip to massively amp up your damage in Steel Path is, once you unlock the arcane slot for your primary weapon, throw out the base damage mod of your build, get rid of Serration, and rather use a base damage arcane on the weapon in the arcane slot, like Primary Merciless, like Primary Deadhead, because those arcanes give you way more base damage than Serration ever could, and with Serration gone now, you have one more mod slot to go into maybe a second element, or into more multi-shot, or into more crit chance, crit damage, which then makes that the entire build overall becomes way more potent. And this right here then is how a Steel Path viable build looks like, and what you should be aiming for if you want to make it big in Steel Path. And before we go on, if you could spare a little like for the video, that would be super helpful because the YouTube algorithm loves those shenanigans. So big cheers for your support, really helps out the channel. And now, let's look at the next big topic. But now, cool, right? You have your right weapon, you have your right Warframe, and they are fully built as far as you can currently build them with regards to where in the game you are. Now, the problem is that even a fully built Warframe and weapon is sometimes just not good enough to go toe-to-toe with the stronger enemies. So, what more can you do to amp up your damage even further? Well, my friends, we're just getting started because right now, we're looking into buffing your damage up. First, we start out with the type of buffs that even the lower level players can get, and then step by step we get more sophisticated with more and more endgame approaches. But starting out, we do with something that really everybody can get, and that is cold status effects. Yes, you heard me right, enemies affected by cold damage take more crit damage if you deal critical hits to them. As for how you deal cold to enemies, well, there are multiple different options. First off, you could of course go and just mod cold onto the weapon that you're using anyway, but that's not all too optimal. Another thing that you could do is just play a Warframe that has an ability that inflicts cold. For example, Uncle Frost or Gauss as well has a great skill that deals cold in an area of effect. Of course, you could also go and use a status primer weapon to apply the cold for your main weapon, but when it comes to status priming, we're going to talk about that in more detail in the next chapter of this video, so let's not get ahead of us right here. The next way to buff up our damage, after we're done with the cold procs, would be companions, which is also something that is available relatively early in the game already. Just to name a few examples, the Adorza Kavat, for instance, can give you a really fat crit chance bonus. There's a certain bond mod that you can put onto any companion that gives you more crit damage when the companion has a certain crit chance, which is relatively easy to achieve with the right mods. You have a bond mod that gives you more fire rate if the shields of your companions are high enough. And just in general, just having a companion with the right mods on your side will make a drastic difference in your personal damage output. But so much for the cold procs and the companions. Next, we have the most obvious thing that comes to mind when we're talking about buffing, and that is Warframe abilities that just buff up your damage. So what we're going to do is go over those that are available through the Helminth system so that you could theoretically use them on any frame that you like. And as you probably already guessed, Roar from Rhino is the #1 when it comes to buffing skills. Not only because Rhino is already available on Venus and therefore the earliest to farm Warframe in the game, but also because Roar just in general is absolutely great. It not only buffs up your weapon damage, but it also buffs up the damage from your companions, from your abilities, and from all your allies around you. Now, there are other buffing skills, like for example Mirage's Eclipse or Zata's Whisper from Zaku, which all have their specialized applications, but I would say use Roar, even though it might not be the optimal choice in every situation. Even in those situations where it is not, it is very close to the optimal choice, so you can't do anything wrong if you go with Roar. But what are your favorite damage buffing abilities in the game? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd be really curious to also hear your take on this. However, even though buffing abilities like Rhino's Roar, for example, are absolutely phenomenal, we're still not done yet when it comes to buffing up your damage. The next thing we're going to look at is Arcanes. Now, to be fair, Arcanes are a bit of a more later game thing, and when you're still pretty early, then don't worry about it just yet, you will definitely get there at some point. But if you already have your Warframe's Arcane slots unlocked, then there are countless options that you could use to buff up your damage output. Either you go for something like Mold Augmented that gives more ability strength to your Warframe if you're dealing damage with the Warframe itself, or when you're going for weapon damage, then Arcane Avenger is one of my absolute favorites because it gives you a big crit rate bonus, just like the previously mentioned Adorza Kavat. And then there are of course countless other arcanes to increase your fire rate, your melee attack speed, all that good stuff. If you have these, your weapon will thank you. And finally, the highest level, most endgame thing to buff up your damage would of course be Archon shards. First and foremost, you could of course go with the red shard for more ability strength or more melee crit damage, but then of course we have the combined shards like the violet, the topaz, and the emerald one, which have traits that give you more ability damage against enemies affected by certain status effects. We have things, for example, that certain status effects like toxin deal more damage. Or if you use the violet one, you can go for even more melee crit damage or electricity damage infusion on your primary weapon. There are so many choices here. By the way, Archon shards can be unlocked once you finish the new war quest. Now, the next big topic that we need to talk about is status priming. Status priming is a tactic that has been in Warframe for ages already, and I think will also remain in the game for the time being because it's really just that strong. In case you've never heard about it, what status priming basically means is, before you pull out your main damage dealing source, what you want to do before that is inflict different status effects onto the enemy that you're targeting, and only after that will you start dealing the actual damage. And there are more than one reasons why this is so strong. First and foremost, every single status effect from every single element in the game has a different effect. For example, we already talked about cold, right? Making enemies more vulnerable to your crit damage. But there are also other really great status effects, like for example viral, which is probably the best effect in the game, making enemies so much more susceptible to your damage that you can actually deal up to 4 times your normal damage just by inflicting 10 viral status effects alone. And then there's naturally other stuff like corrosive, reducing enemy armor, and as if that's not enough, there are certain mods in the game that give you more base damage for every different type of elemental status effect that is currently on the enemy that you're attacking. So long story short, you have a high incentive to deal tons of status effects to all the enemies around you because it will give you at base more damage already, and then there are the beneficial effects from all those elements on top of that. Now, you might be asking yourself, how am I gonna inflict all those status effects? Which tactic is the best here? And as you probably already guessed, there are multiple. First of all, the most obvious approach, and one that pretty much everybody has used at some point, is secondary weapons. The way this works is you equip a specialized secondary weapon that has usually a high status chance and a high fire rate to be able to inflict tons of status effects in a really short time, and then you put whatever element you want to apply to the enemies on the secondary weapon without looking at the actual damage. This secondary weapon is only there for applying the status effects, not for actually dealing the damage. Some really great options here would be, for example, the Epitaph, my personal favorite, dealing damage in an AoE and is therefore perfectly suited to prime multiple enemies at the same time, the Kuvanukor and the Atomos, which is basically the same weapon, and beyond just those, there are also many more. But I know that not every one of you likes this playstyle of constantly having to swap between your primary and your secondary weapon, and I totally get that. And luckily, right now, the game is at a point where we don't really need a secondary weapon for the status priming anymore. We could also go and use our companions for that purpose. There are 2 companions in specific that come to mind, those being Diriga as a sentinel and the Panzervalpaphyla. Now, the Panzer first and foremost is a really great companion, because it can shoot viral quills at the enemy that spread viral status effects throughout the entire room, making it that pretty much every enemy around you is constantly having the maximum of 10 viral procs on them, meaning that you deal more than 4 times the damage to them that you usually would do. However, unfortunately, the Panzervalpaphyla can only do viral and no other status effects. Introducing the Sentinel Diriga, who is absolutely phenomenal. Diriga has a mod called Our Coil. Our Coil is a skill with which Diriga zaps nearby enemies, and if you combine that with the mod Manifold Bond, then each and every enemy zapped will also have all the different status types that are on Diriga's weapon applied to them. All you need to do is mod whatever status effects you want onto that, give Diriga Our Coil a Manifold Bond, and then look at him go. But of course, companions are not the only thing. There are also multiple different Warframe abilities that all serve the sole purpose of applying different status effects to enemies. I'm not going to go into too many details right here because I think the video is already long enough, but what I'm going to say is I recently made a dedicated video where I ranked every single helmet ability in the game, so if you're looking for some good options to maybe spread some status effects, then I would recommend check out that video afterwards, because there you will get more detailed detailed information on which abilities the helmet system has for you to do exactly that. And finally, another tactic, with the recently introduced melee arcanes, especially melee influence, now also melee weapons are great tools to spread tons of status effects in the entire room. The way it works is, with melee influence, whenever your melee weapon deals an electric status effect, you have a chance of dealing all the status effects that are on your melee weapon to other enemies in a big area of effect. I've also recently used this tactic in my Serum video, and as you see in the background, the status spread it provides is absolutely next level. Now, we have talked a lot about buffing up your own damage, having the right mods, spreading status effects so your damage becomes even more potent, but there is a whole other side of the coin, and that is the enemy side of things, aka making them more susceptible to our damage. And the first thing that we naturally need to talk about when it comes to that is armor reduction. As it stands right now, enemy armor starts becoming a problem round about enemy level 80, where armor reduction becomes one of the most important element of any build out there, especially in Steel Path. Now, when it comes to how we reduce enemy armor, there are actually so many different possibilities in the game that I could probably do a whole 15-minute video just talking about all the different types of armor reduction that we can get. So for the sake of today, I'm gonna keep it a bit shorter. One of the most prominent methods here would be either heat or corrosive status effects. Heat is relatively straightforward. As long as an enemy is burning, their armor is cut in half, but it goes up to 100% if the enemy doesn't burn anymore. As for corrosive, the more status effects of corrosive you apply to the enemy, the lower the enemy armor gets, with a cap of minus 80% armor at the maximum of 10 corrosive status effects. Now, if you wanted to, you could also install green Archon shards on your Warframe that will increase the cap of corrosive status effects, enabling you to even full strip the enemy armor, but I think with the new update coming soon, full stripping enemy armor will not be that necessary anymore. But if you don't feel like using corrosive or heat, no problem, there are also tons of Warframe abilities that reduce enemy armor. For example, Necros' Terrify, doing that in a whole AoE, as well as Hildren's Pillage, which can also full strip not only armor but also shields, but therefore needs a bit more ability strength to really kick in, or Styanax's Thero Strike, which also permanently removes armor and shields from enemies in a cone in front of you. These are not the only armor reduction skills in the game, but they would be my personal favorites, and they're also all available through the helmet system, so you could theoretically go and use them on any frame of your choice. Now, there are also tons of other more sophisticated, more in-detail methods of reducing enemy armor, but I don't want to go that deep into the matter right now. However, what I do want to talk about is another type of weakening an enemy that goes beyond just armor reduction, and that would be damage vulnerability. As I also previously said, for example, viral status effects do exactly that. The more you have on an enemy, the more vulnerable the enemy becomes to your damage. Two very prominent Warframe skills for weakening enemies would, by the way, be Rest and Rage from Equinox as well as Caliban's Helmet skill. Those two, by the way, are not the only ones. There are other abilities in the game that can also give damage vulnerability. There's a wiki entrance listing all of them, but because of the fact that those other skills are not available through the helmet system and therefore can't be used on any Warframe out there, I don't want to talk all too much about them right now. One thing I do want to talk about though would be damage over time. See, in many other games out there, the main source of damage are usually the direct impacts of your bullets, and should they happen to inflict any sort of damage over time effects, that's a nice addition, but it usually doesn't make all too much of a difference. In Warframe though, holy moly, damage over time in this game is absolutely off the rails. Let me elaborate. In Warframe, especially against higher level enemies with strong armor, damage over time effects are so strong in fact that they deal multiple times as much damage as the hit that initially inflicted them. First of all, in Warframe there are currently 4 damage over time status effects, those being heat, slash, toxin, and electricity. To make it very simple, electricity is usually never used. When you go up against armored enemies, I personally would recommend Slash, because the way that Slash works in the game is, even though the direct hit you deal to the enemy might not deal a whole lot of damage, the bleed status effects that come from Slash completely ignore enemy armor. As for shielded enemies, I would personally recommend going for Toxin, because while Slash bypasses armor, it doesn't bypass shields and is pretty weak against them. However, Toxin completely ignores shields and goes to the underlying enemy health directly. And in case you go up against enemies that neither have armor nor shields, then Heat is most likely going to be your best option. Now, the reason that in Warframe, damage over time effects deal multiple times the damage that the initial hit did is a phenomenon called double dipping. I don't want to go all too deep in the math and the whole formulas behind it, but what it boils down to is, if you have a weapon that deals damage over time effects, and you equip faction damage onto that weapon, either with a faction damage mod, or by using the skill Roar from Rhino, which is also considered a faction damage bonus, what happens is that this faction damage bonus is first applied to the initial hit that hits the enemy, but in addition to that, the faction damage bonus is applied a second time on top of itself to the damage over time effects. Another relatively sophisticated method to break how damage over time works in Warframe would be a mechanic called Heat Inherit. See, in Warframe, many frames have damage-dealing abilities that inflict heat status effects. However, while heat, being a damage over time effect, is usually relatively strong, since you can't mod Warframes for faction damage the way you can mod weapons for faction damage, usually the heat that Warframe abilities do isn't all that great. However, you can manipulate this. If you go and inflict a heat status effect onto an enemy with a weapon, then the enemy sort of saves your faction damage bonus, your heat damage bonus, and your status duration that was modded onto that weapon in that one instance of heat that is applied to them. If after that, more heat status effects are applied to that enemy, no matter where they came from, all those new heat status effects will inherit those bonuses that the first heat effect had on it. In other words, if you prime enemies with a primer weapon, for example, that has faction damage bonus, heat damage bonus, status duration bonus, all that good stuff, and then you do your Warframe ability that inflicts heat, then the heat inflicted by the Warframe ability will also have all those bonuses that were on the weapon before on it, therefore dealing much more damage. This whole tactic in and of itself is of course not that universally usable because it only applies to heat, but still, on certain frames, it is absolutely phenomenal. If you want to see more about that, you could also check out my Protea video that I released a couple of weeks ago. And finally, if you've done everything that we've talked about so far, and your damage is still not up to that level that you would like it to be, then there is a final thing that you can do that will definitely work on all the enemies regardless of their level, regardless of how much health and armor and all whatnot they have, and that would be scaling damage. See, in Warframe, there are certain frames and abilities that deal relative or scaling damage. What that means is, they don't deal X amount of damage to an enemy, instead, they reduce the enemy health by a certain percentage. Meaning, no matter if your enemy is level 1 or level 1000, it's always going to take exactly the same time to kill them. One very great example here would be Revenant's Reeve, about which I also made a whole build video just 1 or 2 weeks ago. And guess what? Reeve is Revenant's helmet ability, so you can put that on any Warframe out there. But of course there are also other candidates, for example Zaku, who not directly deals percentage-based damage, but the weapons that Zaku steals from the enemies, their damage is based on the enemy level that you stole the weapons from, and therefore the damage output from that ability also nicely scales with enemy level. By the way, the same also goes for Octavia's Rolly thingy, and there are even further abilities in the game, but those 3 are my personal favorites. So yeah, if your personal damage output is still too low, just use one of those abilities and deal percentage-based damage that works equally well on all the enemies out there. And if you now want to know the best Warframes of 2024, then definitely don't miss this guide right here. Another big shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Lycan Shepherd, Turtlepeer, Pepperwolf, Ondakanier 2, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.